So I just want to go quickly over some of the basic general philosophical issues that Rawls discusses in chapter 2 of A Theory of Justice, um, just as a necessary setup for his principles of justice. So let me just share a screen. Right. So an important issue here is that the principles of justice obviously are going to hold for the basic structure. Remember that we introduced this notion of basic structure, and the basic structure is just supposed to be some sort of self-sufficient society. And then we have already mentioned that how the many moving pieces of Rawls's philosophy go together. So within the basic structure, when you consider the original position for individuals that are going to eventually end up in a basic structure, within the original position, just by using a thin conception of the good and a thin conception of rationality, they are going to agree to some principles of justice for their basic structure, given that society's mutually cooperative enterprise, and that these principles of justice are going to be in their own self-interest, according to this thin conception of rationality, right? So within that basic structure, you can talk about a number of institutions. I mean, you could talk about the basic structure as a sort of institution in itself, the largest of the institutions. But obviously, you're going to have proper parts of society that are going to be their own institutions. So, for example, I don't know, perhaps Congress could be a sort of institution. Certain sort of practices, voting practices. Um, uh, etc., are going to count as institutions according to our definition of institution. So the definition of institution is just going to be a public system of rules. That means that everyone knows the rules, and everyone knows that everyone knows the rules. It's fully transparent, with perhaps some exceptions. So, for example, perhaps there are parts of institutions where, for some discretionary reason or some reason that's necessary for the functioning of that society, there needs to be some sort of requirement that only members of that proper part know the rules and are aware of the rules, or they make up their own rules, just as long as these rules obviously do not conflict with principles of justice. But even in those cases where you have some sort of discretion about rule selection for members of that proper part of institutions, even for those cases, it's understood by the larger society that that they are giving these powers or immunities to these proper parts of institutions. So that's more or less the general idea. But in general, there's this presumption of publicity, and obviously some of the other presumptions that have been mentioned in chapter 1. So, for example, there's a presumption of well order, so that people are following the rules. Once people agree to principles of justice and everything that, every other rule that they get out of those and try to implement to institutions, once people agree to that, then they do their best to follow the rules and comply with some of the rules. And also this other idea, obviously, not only that everyone knows the rules and knows that everyone else knows the rules, but that people understand the rules and that they know what is morally required from those rules, morally allowable or morally permitted by the rules, and morally forbidden by the rules. So what sorts of actions are expected of them as members of both the state and institutions within that state, that they know the sorts of behaviors that they can undertake within those institutions, that maybe they are not required, but maybe they are allowable or permissible, and also those that are morally forbidden and just cannot be, they just cannot undertake those activities either within the state or within the institution without violating some of these publicly available rules. And then obviously, you know, given this very wide definition of rules, and where you have this public system, and within those institutions, these systems are going to define offices and positions. So, for example, the institution of how, for example, people can become a senator, right, within a country. How can anyone become a Supreme Court judge or something like that? There are going to be specific rules that define offices and positions, together with rights, duties, powers, and immunities, right? So, in a sense, it's somewhat derivative from the main rules for the whole of society, of the basic structure, which are going to be the principles of justice. But these are going to be their own rules, in a sense. That shouldn't conflict with the principles, right, of justice. So, for example, no one should be allowed to take away anyone's basic freedoms within a specific institution, given their primary role within the principles of justice, right, as principle one. And then you're going to have just this important philosophical distinction between abstract versus concrete institutions. And so the idea is going to be that we can consider things from a more concrete standpoint as things that take place, things that exist at a place at a time, and things considered more abstractly. So, for example, this is just like an elementary example, but we can think about the color blue as just this abstract property, blueness. And we can think of blue things, right, as things that realize that property of blueness. But that's a very simple type of object and concept. And then the sort of objects that we want to consider when we're discussing, for example, political philosophy, are much more structured objects. So, for example, when we consider a state, we consider the idea of a number of people, a plurality of people living within certain rules, abiding by those rules for mutual advantage. You know, if the state is actually preferable to the basic structure, to the state of nature. And then what part of what we should say is that the state in those cases is going to be preferable to if it's preferable to the state of nature, it's going to have its own rules and its own structure. But we can obviously consider the idea of a state in the abstract, right, as just this collection of people living under some rules for mutual advantage, etc., right, supposing that the state is better than the state of nature. And then we can consider more specific states, right? We can consider the nation state of, you know, France or Italy or Spain, etc., right? Instead of just the notion of a state in the abstract. And this distinction between the abstract and the concrete plays a larger role, not only in political philosophy, but generally in philosophy and other disciplines that study abstract systems. So, for example, an ecosystem, you could just think of the notion of ecosystem as just a collection of objects, the living and the non-living ones. So animals together with their environment, for example, or animals and plants together with their environment. And the sort of interactions that take place within that ecosystem. And part of what makes it an ecosystem is that it is self-sustaining in a way, so that there's some sort of equilibrium within it. But obviously it is susceptible to external interference. So, for example, changes in sunlight, changes in planetary conditions, etc., right? So that's like a sort of general idea of an ecosystem. We can consider specific ecosystems, right? Like, for example, the tundra in Alaska, or, you know, the fauna in Yellowstone together with the Yellowstone Park, and how every living being relates there to that environment. We can also extend this distinction, for example, to even more abstract things. So, for example, the difference between a musical score and a performance of that score. One, the score being very abstract, a sort of abstract thing that doesn't exist specifically in in any specific time or place, and a performance which obviously takes place at is realized at a place at a time, so a very concrete thing. The difference between a computational architecture just considered as a series of algorithms where you have inputs and outputs, and a specific computer that you use where you use specific programs to do specific stuff. Philosophers have also discussed this distinction as a type token distinction. So that's just an example of that interesting distinction between the abstract and the concrete. And then obviously we can consider institutions as abstract, as just this set of rules with some individuals following those rules. And obviously there are specific realizations subject to time and place. And then Rawls just going to say that when we are speaking about injustice, then we should think about injustice as applying to specific realizations of abstract institutions, as just this set of public rules distributing offices and rights and duties to people in the abstract to a specific institution within a state or within society. We will say that an institution is unjust if and only if every realization of that institution, every concrete realization of the abstract idea of the institution is unjust. And obviously part of what that means is that people are not getting what's owed to them, that the distribution of rights and duties is not what it should be, right? And obviously to know what that should be, that's a sort of question for which we need to make use of Rawls's principles of justice in order to find out what the proper distribution of rights and duties is going to be. And then Rawls enumerates some characteristics of institutions. So as I mentioned, that's the publicity characteristic. So not only is there publicity, but that there's awareness and awareness of awareness. So certain orders of awareness that people know the rules and that they are following the rules, that they know expectations, things that are forbidden, things that are allowed, etc. Right? So I just mentioned this, and then there's also the distinction between constitutive rules versus strategic maxims. And so here the idea is just the distinction between a set of rules which constitute one of these structures. So I guess it's important to just mention, for the sake of just clarity, that many of these ideas of social institutions have to do with this metaphysical notion, which is called the notion of a social construction. And then a social construction is not, could be considered as a thing or an object or a type of structure that exists in reality, but whose conditions of existence are grounded in conventions and previous agreements by people. So money will be an example of a social construction, right? It's clearly real. It's extremely relevant to our lives. But it's not as if in nature, bills or a credit card actually, have these objective features where they actually are worth exactly that much money, that many goods, some exact quantity of goods. No, bills, coins, bills, credit cards, all of those things only are only good as credit or as a means of exchange within a society, given some rules and conventions about how money is used. So it is the fact that people accept those rules, those conventions about the use of money, the fact that people accept that money can be exchanged for goods and services, and the fact that people are aware of this and are aware that others are aware of this. It is that fact that makes money a social construct, but also a real objective feature of the world. So the fact that something is a social construct, which is, this is something that people get sometimes confused about. The fact that something is a social construct does not mean that it's less objective or that it isn't out there in the world. It just means that it's grounded in social practices and conventions instead of being grounded in nature. And obviously, for example, the laws of a country, which are also a sort of institution, traffic laws or just laws in general, democratic practices about how we are going to elect members of, the Congress or the executive office in some democratic country. All of those things um, depend metaphysically or ontologically for their existence on previous agreement and conventions by people, so that people agree with these rules, that people are aware that others are aware of these rules, etc. So it becomes the fact that we all believe that these things are real and that we should act in certain ways. That's what grounds the reality of these things, right? So if we decided, for example, that money wouldn't be worth anything anymore, tomorrow we could make that decision, for example, right? Which is like which is what happens when, for example, you have a country that becomes independent of another and they want to introduce their own currency. Then maybe they will have to set up a rate of exchange between the currencies, etc., etc. But they do create their own money, right? By fiat, by convention, right? And so with laws and rules and etc. So these things are real. They are objective, but they depend for their existence on the conventions and agreements of people, right? And so rules in this respect, they can constitute, in this ontological metaphysical sense, they can constitute a domain, a specific domain or structure. So for example, chess is a real game. We know what the objective properties of chess are. And in fact, chess is one of the most studied games there in the world. And we know specific, openings and etc. And for chess that maximizes the chances that one player does better than another, etc. So chess is this one thing that's out there. It's objective, but it's not a natural thing. It's not created by nature. It's an artifact which is created by us, by our agreeing that we can use certain wooden boards or plastic boards or whatever with these 8x8 grids and these rules, and that the rules are going to be such and such, and that is going to be the game of chess. The fact that we all agree with that, and that when we teach someone else chess, we teach them the rules and teach them what is allowed and what isn't allowed. All of that constitute or is constitutive of the game of chess. That's what makes chess exists, and is part of what the game of chess is. And we have to distinguish those rules, for example, that constitute chess, or basketball or soccer or whatever, from the strategic maxims that one can use to take advantage of those rules. So obviously, for example, for just to continue the analogy with chess, if one knows all the rules of chess, then there's still the issue of how you can, using those rules and knowing what's forbidden and what's allowed, become the best player possible. Learning opening theory, learning strategy, learning tactics. All of those, for example, applying a strategy to a chess game or applying tactics, all of those things are things that are allowed by the rules of the game. So no one who's actually being a good strategist at chess is breaking the rules. What they are using is within those rules, they are maximizing their chance of doing well in chess. And the same could be said for basketball, for other sports. And specifically, we can say the same thing about society. So for example, if society allows people to become wealthy by, for example, suppose that you're an entrepreneur and you design software that makes life easier for everyone, then perhaps if you live in a society that allows certain economic inequalities, and you are aware that designing that type of software is going to bring about more wealth for you, for example, then perhaps investing money or resources or time in that, if it has a reasonable chance of success, is a good strategy in order to achieve wealth, if that's what you want. And it's not breaking any laws if that society does allow economic inequality. And the same for happiness, right? So for example, society might demand that people, for example, not break the laws, then they don't steal, they don't they don't discriminate, etc. That might be required by the principles of justice of a society, but because people are allowed to seek a certain thick conception of the good, perhaps one who is craving for spiritual depth might seek illumination in philosophy, religion, etc. And as long as that's allowed by the rules, then that's something that they can do just to maximize their goals, or to achieve their goals, in this case, spiritual depth. So many dimensions on which the setup or the constitutive rules of society, they give us the structure, they give us the object, the sort of institution that we're thinking about, but that doesn't exhaust what you can do with that institution. There are also the strategic maxims that you can follow in that institution to succeed or to achieve what your ends. And here's an important claim. Good rules are rules that promote the general welfare, right? So, for example, when you're setting up, as a matter of public policy, when you're setting up a state or an institution, ideally what you want is to have some rules that, even if people aren't thinking about others and just thinking about their own self-interest, if they follow those rules and they try to achieve success by following within those rules, by doing stuff that's permissible, they will increase the general welfare of others, right? Those are institutions which are just good in the sense, first in the sense of efficiency, because you can make everyone better off by making yourself better off in that sense. And second, in the moral sense, that if we want to have institutions, we will want to have institutions that allow us to, even when we are not being considerate of others, still contributing to that society. One example of this, which obviously can be discussed, but it's economic markets, as we have mentioned before. Especially when you constrain markets, for example, you have, so to avoid, for example, negative externalities, I just mentioned, for example, pollution, right? So if you have taxes for pollution, then even people who are pursuing to, seeking to produce something and then therefore create pollution, will be benefiting the rest of everyone else just by paying those taxes to society. And then society can decide what to do with that money, how to allocate those resources. Maybe it can go to the homeless, maybe it can go to the disadvantaged, etc. Right? And then some markets, so for example, when you have markets and they are well regulated by the state, that's a sort of institution which arguably can be considered an institution that maximizes the general welfare, subject to those constraints, obviously, again. And so, and part of the reason to mention that is that obviously the sort of principles of justice that Rawls is going to seek to defend, and that we have been discussing for a number of lectures so far, that those principles of justice are principles of justice that are going to maximize the general welfare, even by people pursuing their own self-interest. That's because there's first this constraint on the first principle about basic liberties that everyone is going to have, and those liberties just the only constraint on those liberties are the liberties of others. So everyone is going to have some share of liberty or some amount of liberty, and then everyone is going to have a fair chance at having securing positions within the institutions of that society, regardless of who they are, regardless of their actual position, their actual nationality, their race, their gender. Given the second principle, the fairness of opportunity principle, they will be able to secure all of those offices, or at least they will not be banned. I mean, it's not necessary that they will be able to secure them, but there's no prohibition on anyone in those societies for any specific citizen to be able to secure those positions. And then if you remember, the idea here was that if those once having these basic liberties and once having this equality of access or equality of opportunity for positions in society and jobs, once that's the case, then you wonder whether if a society fulfilling that if it had a little bit of, if it allowed inequality, economic inequality in some respect, whether it will be even better off. And then if that's true, because it's a conditional claim, the difference principles, the difference principle again, if that's the case, then um, people in that society will be able to compete to derive a certain, more income than others, perhaps, or to be in a better position to acquire more income, given those rules, given the principles of justice. But all of that is going to be for the betterment of the worse off. And as Rawls argues, that's for the betterment of society in general, since we have a duty to the worse off that everyone will agree to, according to him, from the original position in the veil of ignorance. So the principles of justice, given these constraints on liberty and on equality of access to positions, also set up rules that, given those constraints, will maximize the general welfare of society by allowing people within that society to come up with strategies and maxims to achieve their own ends without breaking those other rules or principles of justice. So even those selfish acts or acts that are not necessarily selfish, but that are only motivated by self-interest, just as long as they satisfy these principles, will be by design, which is the important thing. By design, they will be for the welfare of everyone, right? So in a sense, that's Rawls is trying to apply this idea of good rules for the general welfare to the principles of justice as well, as just a general rules for the whole of the basic structure of society. And then just some general comments on principles of justice. We know that we have two principles of justice, one which subdivides in two. So the liberty principle, number one, the fairness of opportunity principle 2b, and the difference principle 2a, right? And then principles of justice are going to be also public set of rules. And just for the sake of simplification, as in the idealized model we were discussing before, we are going to suppose that they hold for a well-ordered, compliant society. So that's just, for the sake of simplicity. We consider the ideal case, and then we explore how to extend that model or modify it for less than ideal cases. And then for the ideal case, we just assume that people will follow orders, that the state is well ordered, that everyone is aware of the rules, and etc. The stuff that we had just been mentioning. And then Rawls just introduces this notion of a formal theory of justice. So principles of justice, as I mentioned, must abide by these constraints of publicity, and they are rule binding, so people will be bound to follow them. So in a society which actually functions well, so that, for example, if people are aware that others are following the rules, they have expectations that others are following them. They are trying to follow them. They do their best to follow them, and even the authorities, they abide by the rules. So the society is fully compliant in this respect. And then those are necessary conditions for principles of justice in the ideal case. And another condition, that has been brought up again and again, is just that they will also determine the distributions of rights and duties that from within that society. But just notice, this is very important, that even if you have all of those requirements, publicity, well order, people are compliant, people are trying to follow the rules, they know that others are trying to follow the rules, officials are trying to follow the rules, and these rules of justice, these principles of justice determine that rights and duties. Even if all of that is the case, that's still compatible with the society being unjust, because, and how can this be compatible? Because perhaps the distribution of rights and duties that these principles of justice that satisfy all of these formal features, it's still compatible that those rights and duties, the assignment or the distribution, is unjust. So maybe everyone is following the rules, maybe everything is public, etc. But perhaps people are still not getting what it intuitively is owed to them. So there's a distribution of rights and duties. For example, suppose that everything goes to just the 1% of the population, most things, and then the 99% just live really terrible lives, right? That's still perfectly compatible with everyone else. So everyone knows that all of their money is going to go to the 1%. Everyone knows that officials are going to follow those rules. Everyone knows that perhaps the people from the 1% argue that that they are perhaps state officials, and therefore, for example, they require, in order to be able to perform their jobs optimally and secure, I don't know, the protection of society, that they need a far greater amount of goods or income than other people. So just as long as, for example, everyone in society can achieve, can become an official. So for example, suppose that just the 1% become officials. Then as long as everyone in society has those offices open, by competition, they could become one of those officials. And as long as, so there's this generality, every individual could be one of them. And as long as everyone knows the rules, and as long as officials are following the rules and people are doing their best to follow the rules, they will satisfy these very general formal requirements for a theory of justice. But that's still going to be a massively unfair society. And then that motivates us to consider the distinction between just a formal theory of justice that specifies these features about what principles of justice are supposed to do, which is distribute rights and duties, and how should they apply, which is they should apply to everyone regardless of of who they are. They will so they have this impartiality property. They have this generality property that they will hold for any individual. So no exceptions. Everyone should follow them. And they have these other properties that we have accepted for the case of idealization, such as that everyone is following them, everyone knows them, etc. So the fact that principles of justice can have all these features and yet lead to those unjust outcomes, that shows, according to Rawls, that there might be some formal notion of justice as just necessary, general and formal necessary conditions that a theory of justice must abide by, and that formal characterization of justice is still short of a substantive notion of justice. And part of what this shows is that you could have a multiplicity of principles of justice. Societies could, and historically we know that societies have followed a number of principles of justice. It's not as if in the past, societies that have existed, or even in the present, that they didn't have some sort of public rules, some sort of criteria or principles that determines who gets what in those societies, who is entitled to certain rights and who's entitled to certain duties. All societies have, in order to be able to function, all societies must have some sort of principle of justice like that. Maybe none of those societies actually satisfy some of the idealized constraints on publicity, etc., but they do satisfy it more or less. And we do know that those societies, that no human society has been fully just. And we also know that some societies approach justice better than others. So obviously what Rawls is saying is that, look, there could be a ton of different types of principles of justice in this formal way, but only some principles of justice are going to be truly just. And then he thinks his principles of justice are actually truly just in a more substantive sense, not just formally, but in a more substantial sense, right? And the way in which he's going to defend that, as we have been discussing, is just by considering what everyone would agree to in the original position behind the veil of ignorance, as long as they have, again, a thin conception of the good, a thin conception of rationality, a thin theory, a thin capacity for rationality, etc. By their own self-interest, they will only agree to stuff that will help the general welfare, with the specific constraint that the general welfare must include the betterment of the worse off, in Rawls's case. But I will discuss a little bit the difference. I will go back again to the difference principle in the next lecture. So then uh, uh, we are going to have then a formal theory of justice that just satisfies these formal requirements, rights and duties, holds for any individual in a well-ordered, compliant society. That's just a formal theory of justice, which at least has the virtue or the feature that it's impartial. So at least some injustices are going to be avoided by the fact that there's this impartiality. But that's not enough. Impartiality is not enough because you can have impartiality in a society that's already given in a sense, where people already have some starting positions or some starting features. And then perhaps the way in which that society is set up is just going to prevent systematically that people achieve some offices, that people achieve some goals. And also perhaps the way in which the principles for distributing rights and goods are set up are never going to allow more than maybe a small minority of people to enjoy the advantages of those formal features of society, formal principles of justice in that society. So that's not going to be enough. We need a more substantive theory of justice. And then for a more substantive theory of justice, this should also follow the formal requirements. It should also be impartial, but it's going to be impartial in an even stronger sense, right? Because instead of considering a specific society, what we're going to do is just go back to this thought experiment of considering how everything looks from this original position where we have taken away every one of the properties that will bias people against others or for themselves. And from there, we can, which is a situation of complete fairness, we can actually argue for principles that everyone will accept if they were rational for their own self-interest. So yeah, that's basically going to be that on these general philosophical considerations. In the next lecture, I will consider specifically how to interpret some of the terms in Rawls' principles of justice, and specifically with a focus on the notion of efficiency for the maximization of welfare in relation to the difference principle versus the minimization of risk for the worse off, right? So a little bit of a comparison of that. And the principle of efficiency I'm going to discuss is called the Pareto principles, the Pareto principle, and we will cover that in the next lecture.